In this video, you'll learn how to create a strategic plan in 2024. So what are the best approaches, the pitfalls to avoid, the modern way of how to create strategy. Now, I have helped over 85 organizations with strategy and strategic decisions. So I've seen a lot, and my own approach has evolved over the years. As I've seen, of course, the world change, but I've seen sort of what works, what doesn't, and what things just generally are not as effective as they may seem in theory. So stick around, especially for those pitfalls, the things that I still see organizations do despite very low evidence for their effectiveness. Let's jump right in. So the high-level overview of what we want to do with a strategic planning process, if you want to call it that. There's a pre-work portion, there's the actual session itself, the strategic planning session, and there's a post-work session. In the pre-work, we want to have a few questions. I use 5 or 6, and we want to use these questions to solicit feedback from anyone who you might want to get it from, but also from people who will be participating in the session itself, as it helps to start the thinking before the actual session starts. This is helpful. So you can do this with surveys, interviews. I've seen organizations use town halls, group discussions, lots of different ways of sharing these questions with your team, with the staff, and then receiving answers back. Don't make this a lengthy process. You can really do this in about 4 weeks to get all the feedback, get it all, and eventually someone has to summarize it and put in some kind of like one-page document so it is more helpful in the session itself. So this is the pre-work. It's not complex. It's about feedback. It's about starting the thinking and doing it in a very tight manner. Then we have the session itself. Now I'll cover this in more detail as this is the bulk, the meat of the strategic planning. So stick around in a few minutes for that. And then finally, we have the post-work section. This is very simple, but also very crucial. This is where we establish accountabilities, where we want to align the strategic items, the priorities that came from the plan, align those with the incentives of the individuals. It could be with their performance reviews, their bonuses, and effectively their self-interest. Why should people get involved in this plan? And this may sound silly, but the number one reason why strategies fail is simply just because they're not implemented. People get caught up in being reactive, in doing whatever they were doing before the strategy, and not actually making the time to go after the new items. So the session itself, and then the post section. That's the high-level overview. Let's talk about the session itself, the strategic planning session. My approach does this in 1 day, 6 hours with breaks, lunch and so on. I think this is actually an appropriate amount of time. I could see a world where you might want to expand this to maybe a day and a half, maybe 2 days. You know, you start talking about weekend retreats where you're going to want to go through different items. But anything more than that, I think is too excessive. Some large organizations do strategy weeks. There could be value in that, but I would bet that a good chunk of that, maybe half of that, is not necessarily strategy, but more brainstorming and creative sessions, things like that. So 1 day to 2 days is sort of the sweet spot for organizations, and it's definitely not happening over months. I want to make that very clear. This is not, 2 hours here, then 2 hours 4 weeks from now, and then 2 hours another 4 weeks, and now you're spending 6 months. You should be able to condense that and do it very quickly, right? 1 or 2 days, 1 weekend, get it over with, and then move on to the actual implementation. Now, what's going to go in the heart of this, whatever length you choose. Now, I have my own preferences, and there's videos in this channel where I cover specifically what I cover in my process, the exercises, the timing, and so on. But let me give you 5 questions to guide your thinking here. So when you create your agenda, you're sort of answering these questions. Number 1, where you're going. This is typically covered by mission and vision. And again, I have videos on my channel that explain how I cover this, because this can be a bit of a minefield, but this is generally the direction of the organization. Number 2, what's changing around you? Where are the shifts happening in your world that you think are worthwhile to pursue and you should be aware of? Again, strategy is all about the future. So we need to know what's happening in the present, what could be happening in the future that we need to adapt to. Number 3, what is not being said. The going through selecting of goals and metrics and that is pretty straightforward. So what needs to happen before then is ensuring that anything that's not being said actually gets resolved. I work with one organization that was trying to change their board, right? They had what's called a working board. They were a small non-for-profit, and they wanted to go into a more professional board that was more focused on governance, not so much the actual tasks. So what was not being spoken about with board members is that some of those board members, and there were about 9, if I recall correctly, were no longer a good fit for the boards, and they would have to step down or be forced to step down. So this needed to be said, and the members who needed to step down, they needed to understand this and then go through it, right? So until you actually start taking these actions, until you make it clear, the goals and the metrics doesn't really quite make sense. So you really want to cover that. Number 4, what are your priorities? This is where we sort of get to maybe the meat of it. You might choose 2 or 3 priorities, right? A handful. I once saw an organization that had 17 priorities, which I think is crazy. We're really talking about a handful here. 2 or 3 I find is a great sweet spot. I was watching Starbucks recently, and their strategic plan had 5, right? And they had things like brand and digital and so on. So you're seeing that even a large organization like Starbucks, quite massive, really has 5, and it's not more than that. So you're talking about a handful. And number 5, who's responsible for what? This is accountability, this is monitoring, this is a lot of the post-work items. So you want to have exercises and a conversation around these 5 questions, and then figuring out the main points from each one. Now, before I move on to the pitfalls, I want to do a quick break here and let you know that if you're looking for help with your strategic plan, if you want to do this faster, more effectively, more impactfully, then get in touch, right? There's a link in the description to my website and my contact form. Let me know about your organization and your details. I'd love to chat, share a few ideas, and if we're a good fit, we can explore something together. Think about that. Now, with that being said, let's go back to the video. Lastly, let's talk about pitfalls. These are the things you need to avoid at all costs, right? There's some flexibility. When we looked at the strategic session before, there's obviously flexibility there around how to structure it, what questions to choose. But here are things you should definitely avoid no matter what. First, lengthy data collection. I was talking to an executive who they went through the 7-month data collection, and they were really happy with it. They interviewed everyone. They went through old projects, old documents, and it felt really productive, right? And I'm sure it generated interesting insights. But then here's the catch: they never actually formulated a strategy. It all sort of fell apart. COVID hit, and that made it even worse. So you had all this lengthy data collection that led to nothing except interesting insights. Kind of like FYI, it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. Most of our clients use this service, or here's a pattern on our clients. That's kind of interesting. But how do you turn that into strategy, right? So the data collection makes sense. I covered some of this in the pre-work I mentioned before, but you have to time box it. This has to be limited. 4 weeks, I think, is a good amount. You might come back and say, you know what, Ruben, 4 weeks is not enough, but we're gonna do 3 months, and that's it. Okay, fair enough, right? Choose your timing, but don't make this a year-long process. 7 months, I think, is just outrageous, in my opinion. Make it really tight, focus on the essential things, and then move on. Number 2, having the wrong people in the room. Now, the process I follow typically ranges from about having 5 people at the minimum, so below that, it doesn't really quite work as well, to maybe 14 people. And there's some wiggle room there. If we were to have 4 people, it might be doable. And if we had, 18 people, that'd probably be fine. But this is not 25 people, it's not 30 people, it's not 40 people. I once saw an organization have this strategic planning session, that's what they called it, with something like 45 people. Now, that's not a strategic planning session. It can be a strategic thinking session, it can be have some of the same elements, but it's not really about formulating a strategy. You cannot do that with 45 people. So you really want to have the right amount of people and the right people in the room. My sense is that people who should be in the room are those that have management responsibility and some kind of responsibility to the organization. So in a large company, this might be someone with P&L responsibility, profit and loss, but typically someone who can make changes to budget and make changes to the way people are being managed. So you determine that in your organization, but right people and the right amount of those individuals. Number 3 is spending too much time on the strategic session itself. I gave you some ranges, right? I think 1 day is more than enough, maybe 1 day and a half, 2 days if you want to be generous, but that's it, right? And if we're talking about 2 days, that's roughly about 12 hours, let's say, right? Over those 2 days. I would not spread that out, those 12 hours over 6 months. I just think that that's not the right way to do it, right? So even if you were to spend, 10 hours over 6 months and you say, this is reasonable, it's still too long, it's too lengthy, right? You want to get this done. People are in the right mindset, they're thinking about it, go through it, block out the day. Organizations tell me all the time, I cannot bring board members, you're so busy, or our staff is so busy, we cannot bring them. Come on, right? You can block out a day, right? If you had some kind of emergency, as many organizations did in a pandemic, I'm sure you can block out one day, go through it, get it done, move on. And number 4 is not aligning the strategy with the self-interest of individuals. I know, again, I mentioned this was crazy or might seem crazy earlier on, but when individuals come into a strategy, they already have very likely a full plate of tasks. They have an endless to-do list. And now you're given more to-do lists, more items. So how do you do that, right? There has to be some conversations and thinking around how this individual can use the strategy to clear a good chunk of their to-do list and go in a different direction, in a direction that's much more appealing to them and the organization, right? So there has to be some work to figure out how to align this with the strategy. You're likely not going to do it in the session itself, right? You only have limited time. But this is the kind of conversations that happen after, right? And when I work with organizations, we spend a lot of time having this one-on-ones and saying, okay, here's the strategy, here's your role, right? You're marketing, your sales, your HR. What's your role here, right? How are you going to contribute? What items will you take? How would that make sense? And so on, right? There's a lot of sort of conversations around making this work. So you have to do this, and this is the way strategy really gets implemented. That is all I have for today. My name is Ruben. I'm an expert in strategic decisions. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all the things you can do in YouTube. I want to mention a couple things before you jump off. First, remember my offer. If you're looking for more help to get this done rapidly, more effectively, get in touch. The link is in the description box below. I also have a newsletter on Substack where I publish content weekly. Readers love it. We get to look at different ways organizations are approaching strategic decisions, like Sears, IKEA, Nike, and so on. So check that out. It's free. Link is also in the description box below. Lastly, in the comments, let me know, how will you modify your strategic planning process based on these ideas? Put it in the comment box below, and I'm sure others will be interested in reading that. Until next time, talk soon.